The enemy thought they had won. For years, they had crushed every species that dared resist them, their fleets carving through entire civilizations like a blade through silk. The war had raged for decades, fought between countless alien empires, each one more desperate than the last. But no matter how hard they fought, the outcome remained the same. The enemy always won. Then humanity arrived. They weren't the strongest. They weren't the most advanced. In fact, compared to the ancient warlords who had battled for centuries, humans were practically children. But they had something else. Something no other species had. It started with a distress signal, another desperate plea for help from a dying world. The broadcast reached the humans late, far too late to save those who had sent it. By the time their ships arrived, the war was already in its final stage. The last resistance was being crushed. Surrender was the only logical choice. But humans had never been particularly good at logic when it came to war. The enemy detected their arrival almost immediately. A single fleet, nothing more than an expeditionary force, barely large enough to be considered a threat. They'd expected a show of force, perhaps a last-minute attempt at diplomacy. What they got was something else entirely. The first strike came without warning. Human ships didn't maneuver like the others. They didn't follow the predictable patterns the enemy had studied for centuries. They moved fast, too fast. Weapons locked onto targets before the enemy could react. Entire cruisers were reduced to fire and debris in the first few seconds. Confusion spread through the ranks. Who were these newcomers? How were they fighting with such precision? Then came the second wave. Drop pods rained from the sky like falling stars, slamming into the enemy's strongholds with terrifying speed. The ground forces that emerged weren't like anything they had faced before. They were coordinated, relentless, and, worst of all, completely unafraid. Reports flooded in from the battlefield. Enemy officers barked orders, but nothing seemed to work. Their defenses crumbled faster than they could reinforce them. Entire battalions went dark, wiped out within minutes. And yet, despite the chaos, one question echoed through every communication channel. How were the humans doing this? For decades, the enemy had been undefeated. They had studied war like a science, perfected it to an art. They had fought against species with superior technology, overwhelming numbers, and even near immortal warriors. And yet, none of them had achieved what humanity had done in mere hours. The truth was simple: humans fought differently. They adapted in real time, predicting their enemies' movements before they even made them. They turned their enemies' own tactics against them. But the real weapon wasn't their technology or their strategy. It was their sheer, unshakable will. They had arrived in a war that wasn't theirs. A conflict that had lasted for generations, swallowing entire civilizations whole. But humans weren't fighting for territory or power. They weren't here to negotiate or find common ground. They were here to end the war. And then, just when it seemed the enemy might regain control, something changed. A final transmission cut through the chaos, overriding every signal on the battlefield. A single voice, calm and steady, broadcast across every enemy channel. "The war is over," it said. "You just don't know it yet." Then, the final phase began. The enemy's command ships, massive, nearly indestructible fortresses that had controlled entire war fronts, began to fall. One by one, they collapsed in fire and ruin. The humans had done the impossible. They had shattered the unbreakable. And in that moment, the war that had raged for decades came down to a single question. Would the enemy surrender? Or would humanity make sure they never had the chance? And that was when the real nightmare began. The silence that followed was unbearable. The enemy, for the first time in their long, brutal history, hesitated. They had crushed countless civilizations, wiped entire species from existence without remorse, and yet something about this was different. Something about humanity was wrong. Reports came in from every battlefield. Their command ships were down. Their fortresses had fallen. Entire divisions units that had once been considered unstoppable were simply gone. And the worst part? They still didn't understand how. The humans weren't using overwhelming numbers. They weren't deploying weapons beyond their technological grasp. They weren't even following the standard rules of war. Yet every move they made was devastating. Every strike, precise. Every decision, lethal. The enemy high command scrambled for answers. Were the humans reading their communications? No. Their encryption remained intact. Had there been a traitor? Impossible. The humans had barely been in this war for 5 hours. So how were they winning? On the ground, things were worse. Elite warrior soldiers who had been bred for battle, who had never known anything but war, were routed like prey animals. They weren't just losing battles. They were losing their nerve. The human soldiers fought with an intensity they had never encountered before. Ruthless, efficient, fearless. Some units tried to retreat, only to be cut down before they could regroup. Others fought to the last breath, desperately trying to understand their enemy in those final moments. But it never mattered. The outcome was always the same. Then came the worst revelation yet. The humans weren't fighting to win territory. They weren't here to establish dominance or negotiate peace. They were here for one purpose alone: to end the war. Panic set in. The enemy leaders scrambled for solutions. There had to be a way out. A counterattack, a retreat, anything. But before they could decide, the humans spoke again. Their message was short, cold, final. 5 hours. It was a warning, or maybe a promise. And the clock was still ticking. Across the warfront, enemy officers barked desperate orders. Defensive positions were reinforced. Entire fleets repositioned. This wasn't about victory anymore. It was about survival. But the humans were already moving. They struck in places no one expected. A communications hub buried beneath a mountain, believed to be untouchable, collapsed in minutes. A war factory that had supplied entire legions with weapons went dark before a single alarm could be raised. Even the most fortified positions, the ones the enemy had spent centuries perfecting, fell in less than an hour. There was no pattern, no predictable strategy to counter. The humans weren't following any known military doctrine. Every battle was different. Every attack, unpredictable. And yet, somehow, everything felt deliberate. The enemy leaders began to suspect the truth. The humans hadn't just arrived at this war blindly. They had studied, planned, waited, and now they had chosen this moment, this exact moment, to strike. But why? What did they know? In the heart of the enemy's central command, the highest-ranking officials gathered in a desperate attempt to salvage what remained of their empire. They reviewed every battle, analyzed every loss, searching for an answer. And then, someone found it. A transmission buried in the chaos of war. A message intercepted just minutes before the first human attack. It wasn't from any known faction. It wasn't from any species still fighting. It was old, ancient. A warning, sent from a civilization that no longer existed. The enemy leaders played the message, their hearts pounding. The audio was degraded, distorted by time and decay, but the words still carried weight. If you're hearing this, it's already too late. We thought they were allies. We thought they were saviors. But we were wrong. So very wrong. They don't conquer. They don't negotiate. They don't play by the rules of war. When humans finally joined the war, it ended in just 5 hours. And then the transmission cut to static. The enemy leaders stared at one another, the weight of those words sinking in. This wasn't the first time. This had happened before. Humanity wasn't new to this war. They had simply been waiting for the right time to finish it. And now that time had come. The enemy command chamber was dead silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of the intercepted message pressed down on them like a force they couldn't escape. It wasn't just the human strategy that terrified them now. It was the realization that this had all happened before. Across the war-torn sectors, the remnants of the enemy's forces struggled to hold their ground. But it was pointless. Every defensive maneuver, every attempt to reorganize, was countered before it could even begin. The humans were already there, one step ahead, dismantling everything with terrifying precision. On the battlefield, commanders screamed into their comms for reinforcements that would never arrive. Troops who had been fighting their entire lives suddenly found themselves outmatched by an enemy that had just joined the war. No one could understand how. No one could figure out what made the humans different. But those who survived long enough to see it firsthand all came to the same chilling conclusion. The humans fought like they had already won. In one sector, a massive fleet, one that had once been the backbone of the enemy's military, was now in full retreat. Their flagship, an enormous war carrier designed to command entire campaigns, had lost all contact with its escorts. One by one, the ships disappeared from the battle map. The flagship's captain, a veteran of countless wars, stood frozen at the command deck, staring at the screen. He had seen fleets fall before. He had seen entire worlds burn. But this was different. His ships weren't being destroyed in direct combat. They weren't being overwhelmed by superior numbers. They were simply vanishing. Every distress signal sent out was met with silence. Every attempt to regroup was met with an enemy that already knew where they would be. It was as if the humans weren't just fighting them, they were hunting them. A junior officer, his voice shaking, broke the silence. "Sir, they're inside." The captain turned, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Inside what?" The officer swallowed hard, his fingers trembling over the console. "The ship. They're already inside the ship." Before the captain could respond, the lights flickered. Then, one by one, the systems began shutting down. And then, the screaming started. Elsewhere, on a distant war-ravaged world, a battered unit of enemy survivors stumbled through the ruins of what was once one of their greatest strongholds. They had barely escaped the last human attack, and they knew they wouldn't survive another. They moved quickly, staying low, avoiding open ground. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every sound sent chills down their spines. The leader of the group, a seasoned warrior with scars from 100 battles, stopped suddenly. The others nearly ran into him, but when they saw his face, they understood why. In the distance, past the crumbling remains of their stronghold, a single human soldier stood alone. His armor was worn, stained with battle, but there wasn't a single hint of fear in his posture. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was just watching. The warrior felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how war was fought. Then, without a word, the human lifted a small device and activated it. A moment later, the ruins behind the enemy survivors detonated. The explosion tore through the landscape, a chain reaction of destruction that consumed everything in its path. The enemy warriors barely had time to react before they were thrown to the ground, debris raining down around them. When the dust settled, they turned back toward the human soldier. But he was gone. One of the surviving soldiers gasped for air, their voice barely a whisper. "What? What are we fighting?" There was no answer. There never was. Back in the enemy command center, the highest-ranking leaders stared at their dwindling battle reports, unable to form a response. Their empire, their military, everything they had built over centuries, it was collapsing in mere hours. The humans weren't just winning, they were erasing everything in their path. And then, the final message arrived. It came through every channel, hijacking their communications, overriding their encrypted frequencies. A single human voice spoke. Calm. Steady. 2 hours left. And just like that, the message cut out. The enemy leaders felt their blood run cold. 2 hours. That was all the time they had left before what? Surrender? Extinction? No one knew. But they all understood one thing. The humans had already decided how this war would end. Panic spread through the enemy ranks like a wildfire. Orders were shouted, strategies were rewritten, and desperate attempts were made to regain control. But deep down, every commander, every soldier, every leader knew the truth. This wasn't a war anymore. It was a countdown. 2 hours. Across the shattered battlefield, resistance collapsed. The once proud fleets that had ruled the stars now drifted in ruin, their command ships silent, their captains either dead or too afraid to speak. Planets that had been strongholds were now graveyards. Entire divisions went dark, their fate unknown, their last transmissions filled with nothing but static and screams. And the humans? They were everywhere. On the surface of the enemy's central war planet, a squad of survivors huddled in the remains of a bombed-out control center. Their weapons were useless. Their communication systems had been hijacked. The only thing keeping them from outright surrender was the fear of what would happen next. A sound echoed from the darkness outside. Slow. Steady. Footsteps. One of the soldiers tightened their grip on their rifle, even though they knew it wouldn't matter. Another soldier whispered a prayer in their native tongue, but no one was listening. The leader of the group swallowed hard and activated his visor's thermal scan. There was nothing. No heat signatures. No movement. But the footsteps were still there. Getting closer. The squad fell silent. The air around them felt heavier, charged with something they didn't understand. Then, without warning, the lights flickered once, twice, before dying completely. A single red light blinked to life on the command console. A human voice, distorted but unmistakable, whispered through the darkness. 1 hour left. The squad broke. Some ran. Some dropped their weapons. Some simply sat down, staring into nothing, realizing they had already lost. In orbit, the last remnants of the enemy fleet prepared for a final stand. The highest-ranking commanders gathered in the war room of their last remaining dreadnought, their faces grim. There were no more reinforcements, no more fallback plans. Just this one ship, carrying the last of their empire's leadership, drifting in the void. The communications officer turned, his voice shaking. "We've lost contact with every remaining ground unit. We're the last ones." No one responded. There was nothing left to say. Then, the proximity alarms began screaming. Hundreds of ships, human ships, dropped out of hyperspace, surrounding the dreadnought from all angles. No grand announcement. No demand for surrender. Just silence. The enemy admiral clenched his jaw. They're waiting. Waiting for what? The answer came in the form of a single incoming transmission. The admiral hesitated before accepting it. The screen crackled to life, revealing a human figure standing in the dimly lit bridge of a warship. His face was shadowed, unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but absolute. 10 minutes. The transmission cut off. The admiral's hands trembled. He looked around the room, searching for answers that didn't exist. His officers were frozen, their eyes hollow. Some were gripping their weapons, but they all knew it was pointless. 10 minutes. That was all they had left. And then the countdown truly began. The admiral's heart pounded as the countdown ticked away in his mind. He had spent a lifetime leading fleets, outmaneuvering enemies, crushing rebellions before they could start. But now, sitting in the command chair of what was once the most feared warship in the galaxy, he was powerless. Trapped. The human fleet did not move. They held their position, their weapons primed, but silent. It was psychological warfare at its finest. The waiting. The suffocating inevitability. One of his officers whispered, "What if they're bluffing?" The words sounded ridiculous, even as they were spoken. No one had ever seen humans bluff. They didn't need to. Every battle, every engagement in the last 5 hours had proven one thing: when humans said something was going to happen, it happened. Then the ship's lights dimmed. The admiral's breath caught. What? The emergency systems flickered on. A red glow bathed the bridge. Status screens stuttered with unreadable data. Warnings flashed across every console. The engineers scrambled to stabilize the systems, but nothing responded. One by one, the ship's defenses powered down. Shields. Weapons. Even the escape pods. A cold realization settled over the crew. The humans weren't just waiting. They were already inside. A junior officer gasped, pointing to the main viewport. "Sir, look." Beyond the glass, space itself seemed to shimmer. Shapes, barely visible, moved against the stars. Not ships. Not drones. Something else. A single figure emerged from the shadows, drifting in the void, untouched by gravity. It was humanoid, but not in a suit. No armor. No oxygen supply. Just floating. Watching. The bridge fell silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The figure tilted its head, and then the Admiral's screen flickered, and suddenly it was everywhere. Across every monitor, every device, every control panel, the same image appeared, a single, unblinking human eye staring back at them. A voice, calm and absolute, echoed through the ship's failing systems. The war is over. Then everything went dark. The silence was absolute. For a single, breathless moment, nothing moved. The bridge crew sat frozen, their screens black, their controls unresponsive. The Admiral's fingers hovered over the dead command console, his mind racing through possibilities, but none made sense. The ship, the pride of the fleet, was gone, powerless, conquered without a single shot fired. Then, something shifted. A low mechanical hum vibrated through the floor. The emergency lighting flickered erratically, pulsing like a heartbeat. Somewhere deep within the ship's core, systems were rebooting, but not by their command. The unblinking human eye still dominated every screen. And then it spoke again. Surrender confirmed. The words were simple, but the weight of them crushed the Admiral's chest. He tried to respond, to issue orders, but his throat tightened, refusing to obey. His empire had fought for centuries, built its dominance over the ashes of weaker civilizations. They had conquered planets, enslaved species, rewritten history to their will. And now, all of it was gone in 5 hours. A new screen blinked to life, revealing a feed from the outer hull. The crew watched, barely breathing, as the human fleet moved. Not forward in attack, not in pursuit of further conquest. No, they were leaving. One by one, the massive warships turned, slipping into the void, disappearing as quickly as they had arrived. Confusion rippled through the bridge. Why would they leave? They had won. They had crippled the entire Empire's defenses. They could have demanded anything: tribute, territory, absolute control. But instead, they were vanishing like ghosts, leaving nothing but devastation in their wake. A final message scrolled across the main screen. This war was never about victory. It was about ending it. The Admiral's stomach twisted. The meaning was clear. The humans hadn't come to rule. They had come to eliminate the war itself. And as the realization set in, so did a cold, creeping fear, because something about it felt unfinished. Then, without warning, the ship's power surged back. The bridge blazed with light, screens flashing, controls reactivating. A flood of sensor data poured in, and the crew scrambled to make sense of it. Communications, previously jammed, burst to life with frantic transmissions from what remained of the fleet. But as the Admiral opened his mouth to demand a report, a single alert stole his breath away. A new signal had just appeared. Not from the humans. Not from any known faction. It was something else. Something vast. Something old. And it was waking up. The bridge was eerily quiet. The Admiral's breath came slow and measured, his mind racing through possibilities. The humans had left, but the war wasn't over. No, something else had just begun. The new signal pulsed on the screen, its presence cold and unfamiliar. It wasn't coming from any known world, any known fleet. It was deep, buried beneath the very foundation of their empire, as if it had been waiting. One of the officers hesitated before speaking. "Sir, this signal, it's pre-Dominion." The words sent a shiver down the Admiral's spine. Pre-Dominion? That would mean it was older than their empire itself. Older than their wars. Older than even their knowledge of the stars. He stared at the screen, watching the signal grow stronger, as if waking from a deep slumber. Then, a message, just one, flashed across their comms. It wasn't from the humans. It wasn't from any living force they knew. "We see you." The words hung in the air like a final, inescapable truth. The war was never just between them and the humans. There had been something beneath it all, something buried in the ruins of their past. And now, because of what had happened because of the humans, it had woken up. The admiral clenched his fists. There was no time to reflect on defeat. No time to consider what was lost. The humans had come and left in 5 hours, dismantling an empire that had ruled for centuries. But in doing so, they had torn open something far worse. The bridge crew scrambled to analyze the data, but the readings were beyond their comprehension. Across their remaining worlds, ancient structures long thought to be abandoned flickered with life. Their empire had always assumed itself the greatest force in the galaxy. But the truth was clear now. They had been standing in someone else's shadow all along. And now, those who had been watching were finally stepping forward. The admiral exhaled, straightening his uniform. There was no time to dwell on past mistakes. No time to mourn what had been lost. The only question now was what came next. The stars outside remained unchanged, silent, distant, endless. But they no longer felt the same. The galaxy had moved forward in ways no one had expected. The humans had left their mark, and now the real war was about to begin. And this time, there would be no mercy.